So, good afternoon everybody. Thank you for inviting me here today. Thank you all for coming to listen after lunch. It's perhaps a little bit unfair to you straight after lunch, but I'm going to dive into the importance of basic local individual scale processes for modelling and understanding socio-ecological systems like the UK landscape system. But before I do that, I just want to echo the point made by several previous speakers about the global context of UK landscapes, and that it's now impossible to divorce UK landscape change from global landscape change. For instance, our food consumption patterns require agricultural production around the world, especially and increasingly in South America, and we have a similar international footprint in terms of use of water resources around the world because of our consumption patterns. Meanwhile, in Europe and in the UK in particular, over the past century, one major trajectory of landscape change has been a sort of greening process. If you notice the years at the top here going up from 1900 to 2010, this is one recent reconstruction of historical European land cover change. Then you can see there's more and more dark green, more and more forest appearing right across Europe during that period. And this has been a major form of landscape change in Europe, and indeed right across much of the developed world in recent years. Again, here the dark green areas show afforestation. But this has occurred at the direct expense of tropical deforestation, the red areas in tropical regions on this plot. So we've really been exporting a lot of our environmental impacts through recent UK landscape changes, which is not something that we will have the luxury of doing for much longer. And so we have to take account of this process in our planning for future changes. Even ignoring those international changes, there have been several findings that suggest that our livestock production in the UK and in Europe is already quite substantially exceeding the safe operating space for humanity in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss and nutrient flows. This report here just came out a few days ago and suggests that we may be doubling or producing more than twice as much of these negative externalities as we can afford to do, leading to this fairly dramatic headline that we need to halve our meat and dairy production just within Europe without taking account of international effects. So to come back to the plot that Paula showed earlier, we are currently on a trajectory towards fairly high-end climate change, the red areas up there, but we in the UK internationally, we have obligations now to be in this blue area down here, net negative emissions, and to limit average global temperature increases to 1.5 degrees or at least less than 2 degrees Celsius. And so we need, when we're thinking about UK landscapes in the future, we need to take account of this global context and what we want to achieve both locally and internationally. And of course we have, as we've heard, we do have lots of models, lots of tools available that can help us do this, and there's been a lot of research published recently using big global integrated assessment models that identify these pathways towards achieving the Paris target, towards keeping global warming to what we regard as safe levels. At the same time, there's been a lot of research criticizing these models and saying that the results they produce are not believable, that they involve the rates and extents of change in social and in ecological systems that are completely unprecedented, if not completely unrealistic. And one major reason that these models do that is because they don't represent many of the basic underlying processes by which these changes happen. So they have to make assumptions about the rates and the nature of change in the land system. For example, these plots show the spread of oilseed rape across England and Wales from 1969 onwards. And this spread was driven especially by the introduction of subsidies in the 1970s, following which it became economically rational for farmers to grow oilseed rape over very large areas, as they ultimately did, of course. Now it's a very common crop. But this didn't happen overnight. It took something of the order of 20 years for the crop to gradually spread, gradually take off, and finally reach something like its theoretical optimal. So it isn't the instantaneous process that most large-scale models assume it is. And this is a pattern that we find again and again around the world in the uptake of different crops, different subsidy schemes, different policies different land management approaches. I'm not sure you can see these, but they're examples from different countries and different time periods. And they share this common slow starting point, then increased uptake, and when the data goes far enough, we eventually see a leveling off. But that never occurs until at least 10 years. It's a process that takes decades rather than days or even years. Interestingly, we can find no evidence that this has increased in speed with the growth of the internet, social media, or forms of modern mass communication. And the best statistical explanation that we've been able to find for all of these examples is direct neighbor-to-neighbor influence between farmers, foresters, land managers. So it's still people talking to each other and influencing one another, which of course is a very spatially and temporally structured process. To broaden it out slightly, we also know a lot about climate change adaptation in general, and in particular here with respect to Swedish forest owners. There's a lot of evidence from social science that we can put into our models in some form. And this suggests that climate change adaptation does depend on things that we measure and model commonly, like socio-demographic factors, objective adaptive capacity, but also on things that we tend to neglect, like experiential factors, cognitive factors, social factors. And there are lots of them. They're very important indeed in determining whether and how people actually adapt to climate change. So it's important, these and many other examples suggest that it's really important we recognize the social, human, behavioral nature of the land system when we try and understand or manage or model it. And in recognizing that, we also have to recognize that accurate prediction is impossible and that we have to explore our uncertainty about the system very rigorously. This also means that model calibration or validation, as I think Jackie perhaps said earlier, should not be a process of fitting to historical observations, because we have no guarantee that the trends, the changes that happened in the past will remain consistent or valid in novel future contexts, especially when we consider interactions with equally complex ecological systems. It turns out that in the modeling community, at least, we're not very good at, we recognize these issues, but we're not very good at taking account of them properly. These results are from a review that we did a couple of years ago of behavioral models of climate change adaptation in land-based sectors. And I just wanted to illustrate that the main approach, even in behavioral models, is to treat adaptation as an individual economic process. In other words, we model climate change adaptation as a consistent, homogeneous, instantaneous, fully economically rational response on the behalf of individual land managers or users. Where these models exist, they also tend to be at fairly small scales. We found one model at a national scale and absolutely none incorporating these sorts of behavioral processes at larger scales. So there's no way of translating our knowledge of decision making in the land system up to really globally relevant scales here. And perhaps worst of all, by far the most common approach to model validation and uncertainty analysis was to ignore it completely here on the left. And the second most common approach was to tune the model to reproduce past observations and then assume that it was valid for the future, which of course is highly worrying when we're looking at new results from climate change. One more review result from a different review that's just been published that I thought was very interesting. This shows the different factors included in policies concerned with the land system, the SDGs here, and then on the right-hand side, a literature review of land system analyses and models. The depth, the darkness of the colors in this column shows the number of models that include each of these factors. And just without going through the factors, I think it's notable that in the modeling analysis community, we're focusing a lot of effort on things that actually aren't that important in these policies. So we're very interested in things that policymakers perhaps aren't interested in. So we need to make sure that our models are actually relating to the factors that people really need to know about when they're making decisions. For example, on this plot, there's a great deal of attention being paid to landscape composition and configuration. in our model. So we know things like this draft map of a pan-European habitat network. We're quite good at representing these patches. What we're not very good at doing is representing the processes by which species disperse or don't between those patches, reproduce within them, and how they will adapt within this very fragmented habitat network to the effects of climate change. And this is one likely reason why this result, that was a very high-profile finding and surprising for many people recently, caused such a sensation. This was a paper showing that the biomass of insects within German protected areas had decreased by more than 3/4 in 27 years. And so these are protected areas, so that this implies that it is processes resulting from landscape change around those areas that's causing these huge losses in insect biomass, which of course is very concerning. And even beyond that, this is an example of a process-based model that suggests we also need to consider the genetic level. This circle shows the genomes present in a population of aquatic alpine insects. And the present day, all of these black and white lines are present in the population. The black lines show the genomes predicted to be present by 2080 under the A2A climate change scenario. And what you can see, there are black lines in almost every sector, so there are only 3 of these species are expected to become extinct, but most of the genetic variation in each of those species will be lost according to this model and this scenario. And this is the sort of result that is actually hugely important. It implies ongoing extinctions beyond this point, but it's exactly the kind of thing that we miss when we simply look at habitat patches without considering the ecological processes by which species live within them. Once again, though, we do have a lot of ecological evidence. As we have social science evidence for land use decision making, we have ecological evidence for these ecological systems. And a nice example is the WREN project that's represented here by Kevin Watts from Forest Research. This is looking at almost 150 different woodland sites in England and Scotland with different forms of spatial and temporal change in woodland properties, and then doing really intensive ecological surveys to find how those, to try and disentangle how those different rates and forms of change impact on ecological processes. So this again gives us the kind of evidence that we can build into process-based models of these systems. So overall, process-based modeling certainly should, I think, have some role to play in our understanding of landscape development. These models exist. They're quite widespread in land use and in ecological sciences, usually agent or individual-based models, which focus on individual level behaviors and interactions and allow the system level behaviors to emerge from those. An important feature of these models is that they're stochastic, they're non-equilibrium, they're path-dependent, so they can produce a really wide range of outcomes. They're very unconstrained, which means they have very high requirements for data, for inputs, and also for computational resources. However, they are becoming increasingly computationally efficient and scalable, and they share this basic individual level architecture, approach, perspective that means in principle they can be combined relatively easily, we would hope. So I thought I'd just show a few examples just to finish off from work that I've been involved with. This is a result from an agent-based model of land use change applied to the European land system. The model is called Competition for Resources Between Agent Functional Types. For those of you familiar with the idea of plant functional types, this uses a parallel simplification by which agents, land managers, are grouped according to their environmental requirements and their productive potential, as well as their behavioral characteristics. This is a way of making agent-based modeling more computationally efficient and scalable. The important thing about this sort of model is that it allows the modeled land system to develop on the basis of competition between land managers who can produce a range of ecosystem services and can have a range of economic and non-economic motivations for doing so. And so we don't have the equilibrium assumption that supply always equals demand that is a part of many global, large-scale, economic-based land use models. And just to highlight one interesting tendency in this model, if we apply it to a slightly more, well, middle-range climate change here with a fairly benign socioeconomic scenario, then we begin to see some de-intensification of land use in Europe and some abandonment of marginal areas. And this becomes much more pronounced as we move towards more dysfunctional socioeconomic scenarios. And in the end, looking at SSP3, which is a highly dysfunctional socioeconomic scenario, there's societal, political, economic collapse, we get this highly dysfunctional land system. You can see it's very fragmented, heterogeneous. There are large grey areas of unmanaged land right across Europe. And this implies widespread starvation within Europe in this scenario. And it's not a result that you would get from an economic model that would assume the economic system will always provide enough food to feed people. Now, of course, this could be wrong. It is wrong in a specific sense, but it does give us a different perspective on what might happen in these extreme scenarios of future change. Interestingly, it's driven by these very steep declines in the underlying capitals that support production in the land system. A huge drop in human capital, in manufactured capital, in financial capital. So there are simply not the resources within the land system to enable people to keep producing in the way they have done. And this is in a way, not in a very rigorous way, but it is a sort of mirror to historical developments in Europe when we had an increase in these capitals over time. And actually looking back, in this case in a small region of the Belgian Ardennes, which happens to have very good historical land cover records, moving back through time, we start with this modern, fairly homogeneous, fairly simple landscape in terms of what's there. And as we go through this process of decreasing financial, technological, human capitals, we get back to this sort of landscape that we were producing with lots of relatively unmanaged areas, highly fragmented land uses, and a land system that doesn't support the sorts of populations that we have nowadays. So briefly, parallel examples in ecological models that I thought would be perhaps worthwhile highlighting. The range shifter model that was developed mainly in Aberdeen University gives us a way to do a sort of similar modelling approach for species movements, dispersal, reproduction, evolutionary responses to changing environments and changing landscapes. This has been applied quite widely and has a lot of potential for actually parameterizing two individual species and seeing how they respond to specific changes in the future. And we've done a sort of initial combination of that model with the crafty ABM of land use that I just showed you. In this case, we applied it to a hypothetical example of pollinator populations in an intensifying agricultural landscape. And what we found at a broad level was that in the coupled models on the right-hand side, these declines here in the number of cells occupied by pollinators and the total supply of crops were much greater when we coupled the models than they were when the models were uncoupled. So as Paula showed earlier, the cross-sectoral, or in this case the socio-ecological interactions in the land system actually give us quite different dynamics. In this case, they're still in the same direction, but they're much more severe when we take account of the socio-ecological feedbacks. I have to mention this partly because it's very interesting, very exciting model, also because it's very local to where we are now. The Madingley model was developed just down the road from here. It's a next generation model of ecosystems and biodiversity, or to put it more dramatically, as the original paper did, it's a model of all life on Earth. It's a cohort-based model of ecological dynamics in terrestrial and marine environments, so it is in some sense a model of life on Earth. And it allows the model, or these ecosystems, to respond to human activity in the form of HAMP, human appropriation of net primary productivity. And again, this is clearly highly aggregated, a simplified representation, but it does allow for some of these low-level, individual, almost level interactions within cohorts by which we can incorporate ecological processes in this sort of model. And again, it's possible to couple this model with a land use ABM, and we're trying this at the moment. We're at very early stages, but if we feed it with a result, a year-by-year result from our land use model, then we get responses in, for example, total living biomass. You can see the annual shift in total living biomass here, as well as a sort of trend in the initial years of this particular simulation. This is very early days, but it does suggest a possibility for modelling full socio-ecological systems at large scales without abandoning all process accuracy in the process. So just to finish off, there are plenty of challenges still, of course, for this work, but I think it is important that microprocesses are accounted for in some way. They can and do have macro consequences, as do our decisions, our planning of UK landscapes. But there's a lot of understanding in social and ecological sciences that we still need to incorporate into our especially large-scale models. And we need computationally efficient methods of doing this, not only so that we can successfully simulate these systems, but also so that we can explore uncertainty and then hopefully communicate it in a helpful way to decision makers. There's also, in principle, there is no one correct way of doing this, so we need a diversity of modelling approaches to understand uncertainty and to understand what implications different sorts of knowledge have for these for our outcomes. And somehow we need to find an appropriate balance between process accuracy and very large-scale results that we need to inform governmental decisions at national and national scales and above. And just coming back to that earlier plot, we also need to always make sure that we're reflecting policy-relevant outcomes when we do this. It's not purely an academic exercise. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot of thought-provoking results there within those models that you showed. Thanks for that terrifyingly glimpse into the future. I wonder if we should call ourselves the computational Cassandra movement. But the question I've had is that a lot of these, how much of these models are based on the assumption of a, if you like, neoliberal capitalist system of government, and have you looked at, are there alternatives that would model out in a different way, perhaps?
It's probably another advantage of modelling of this kind that you can. I mean, in traditional models, you're locked into the economic equilibrium assumption, so that's a basic tenet of the model. In these, you're not. They are more flexible. So, for example, what you can do is include a full, potentially, range of ecosystem services, and then you can decide that some of those are more valuable than others, even if it's in a non-economic sense. So you can say that we will have a policy to preserve biodiversity, and that will become more worthwhile for the agents to do in this model. So you can begin to explore some of those alternative prioritizations.
Really interesting. Can you say a little bit more about how you generate confidence in the model? I mean, I can see how you can tweak the goals and the endpoints, but when does it stop being a model and become a representation, a useful representation of reality?
I think, useful is a good word. I think it is useful in the sense that it exposes things we don't know that we hide in normal modelling, because we can produce very definite outcomes if we assume economic equilibrium, but in fact they're likely to be wrong, as we keep finding. When things actually happen in the real world, they don't happen according to our assumptions. So I think that they're useful in the sense of giving an alternative perspective. In terms of actually producing results that we believe, in some sense, they will never be predictive. It's simply not, I would argue, not possible, whatever you do, to be predictive. But the more data, the more knowledge you build into them, the more they do actually tend to converge. And what we find is that in the more extreme climatic and socioeconomic scenarios, it's very hard to move away from, in this case, a fairly catastrophic result. That however people behave, there's simply not enough play in the system to produce a nice, productive land system. Whereas in the more benign scenario conditions, actually different forms of human behavior can produce very different outcomes. So I think they're useful in the sense of exploring how certain we can be in different contexts, given our knowledge, hopefully.
Go to the back here.
yeah, person in blue, and then to the front. Yeah. Afterwards.
So that was really fascinating. And in other areas like, say, studies of groundwater management, one sees agent-based models used to address normative questions like what kind of agent and what kind of behaviour do I need to introduce into this model system to, say, tip the dynamics from a so-called tragedy of the commons to a coordination game to conserve a resource. And I just wonder whether you've done that kind of use of the model here with this obviously quite sophisticated agent-based land use.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think it's very important that we actually get towards normative modelling with these, because we can produce pathways till the cows come home and not really know how to get there. One thing that I had to delete from the presentation was modelling policy processes. So that we have institutional agents also in this model, and they're being developed in other models too. And you can give those institutional agents objectives and actions and so on, and then you can let them try and achieve whatever objectives you give them. So then you have a fully normative model trying to achieve a particular outcome, which can involve behavioural change at the individual level as well. So I mean, that's clearly it's a very difficult task indeed, but there are movements in that direction. Yeah.
So I very much like your emphasis on validation and evaluation, and for me that's absolutely central. And that obviously has to be done with respect to data. But then you were scornful of the idea of using historical data, which is often the only way that you can evaluate the emergent features of the model, which is generally to do with how the population will evolve.
Yeah.
So could you say a bit more about that?
Yes, sure. I hope I wasn't completely scornful of it. I think it's relied on far too heavily in land system modelling. That if we reproduce a past observation, then we're accurate for the future. And actually, I mean, in human systems, philosophically from social sciences, only a very small minority of people, I guess, would argue that it's fully predictable, that we know how people will behave in certain circumstances. And so in a sense, the development of social systems is one realization of potentially a very wide range of possible outcomes. So when we reproduce historical observations, yes, our models should be able to do that, but they should also be able to produce a range of counterfactuals that could have happened in those circumstances. So it is about comparing, making sure that we produce realistic outcomes, but also that we maintain the flexibility to produce other possible outcomes that simply didn't happen in the past.
But isn't it a main feature of your validation that you can reproduce the historical data? I mean, you may also wish to model counterfactual processes. I can see that.
No, I think it's one feature. I think the most important thing, which is less simple to do in a way, is to achieve process accuracy, to be sure that the basic processes are accurate. And then the actual outcomes, we can have some confidence they are realistic, they're possible, even if they have never been seen in the past. And of course, achieving process accuracy also involves some fitting to data and to knowledge of some sort, but there is a balance to be struck.
Good. I'm afraid we'll have to move on to the second talk. So if I could perhaps ask those who didn't get a chance to ask a question to catch up with Calum afterwards, and to thank Calum again for a very interesting presentation. Thanks.